The sun cast a warm, cheerful glow over the spacious, beautifully adorned garden of the wedding chateau, the reception venue for George and Emily's wedding. The atmosphere buzzed with joy, as one would expect on such a special day. The couple looked stunning in their wedding attire. Emily radiated a beauty she had never imagined for herself, while George, despite a faint frown etched on his face, was no less striking. They sat together at the table reserved exclusively for the bride and groom, the centerpiece of the celebration. No one could have guessed that beneath the cheerful facade were two hearts consumed by conflicting emotions. Anger burned fiercely within George, while fear of the unknown gripped Emily's heart. Both worked hard to maintain a semblance of happiness for their guests, though George was clearly struggling to keep up the act. For Emily, putting on a cheerful front was not just a choice, it was a necessity. Whether she wanted to or not, she felt compelled to convince her stepmother of her happiness, hoping the message would reach her father, who had vowed never to attend her wedding. Her stepmother was the only family member who came to celebrate with her. Her step-siblings couldn't have cared less. Summoning every ounce of willpower, Emily had begged Uncle Lucas to walk her down the aisle. Reluctantly, he agreed, but left immediately after. Initially, her uncle had refused, calling it a taboo for him to give her away while her father was still alive. But with her father's staunch opposition to the marriage, hoping he would play the role was as unrealistic as expecting the moon for breakfast. Yet, the wedding had to proceed. Not even the absurdity of it all could deter her. And absurd it was, marrying a man she barely knew, who knew just as little about her. In this 21st century, with all her education and exposure, it felt like the very embodiment of madness. But as the saying goes, it was too late to turn back time. The vows had been exchanged hours earlier in church, binding them as husband and wife before God and the assembled guests. The crowd was mostly from George's side, his co-workers, family, friends, and even friends of friends. In stark contrast, Emily could count on one hand the people she knew, and that left her feeling isolated and adrift, like a castaway on an unfamiliar island. Not even her stepmother's presence could ease the unease. The situation felt so foreign that even her bridesmaid, who occasionally touched up her makeup to keep her looking flawless, was practically a stranger. She was a friend of George's sister, handpicked by George's grandmother, who believed she complemented Emily perfectly. Still, she steeled herself to endure the ordeal she had willingly stepped into, knowing she couldn't abandon herself now. In this moment, more than ever, she longed for her mother's presence. "It's time for the bride and groom to cut the wedding cake," the MC announced with enthusiasm. "But before that, I'd like to invite Miss Olivia Kate to share with us the details about this beautiful cake and its significance to our lovely couple." Amid the applause, Olivia Kate gracefully made her way to the stage, took the microphone, and began speaking. "Well, on behalf of Olivia's bridals, I'm delighted to share with you that." But George wasn't paying attention. He kept glancing at the watch on his left wrist, and at other times, he checked the order of program placed on their table. He was doing so once more, his restlessness clearly visible. "Just number 5, he muttered to himself, his voice tinged with frustration. "And what is this silly woman rambling on about?" he muttered under his breath, scanning the crowd without focusing on anyone in particular. His eyes kept darting around, never once settling on the beautiful woman seated beside him. He felt that the more he forced himself to ignore her, the more bearable the entire nightmare became. "I need to visit the gents," he whispered to his friend Gavin, seated by his side. Gavin was his best man. "Come again?" Gavin replied, his eyes fixed on Olivia Kate as he tuned in, listening intently to her speech. K this. George cursed under his breath, getting up as he made his way toward the restroom. Immediately, his friend grabbed his arm, stopping him from standing. "What's the problem with you, man?" Gavin asked, now turning his full attention to George. "I want to ease myself," he muttered quietly under his breath. "No way that's happening, because it's time to cut the cake made with honey, love, and bliss," he replied sarcastically, then joined in the applause from the audience. "You have my permission to cut it, that's why you're my best man," George said, standing up. Just then, Emily rose as well, her expression bright and cheerful, despite having overheard the last part of their conversation. As Miss Olivia continued her speech, Emily couldn't help but hope that the honey, as Sarah had described it, symbolizing sweetness in their marriage, would truly sweeten the life ahead of her. She even wished it could sweeten George's attitude, if only for an hour. "Well, that's why we also have the groom," George replied with a smirk as they made their way to the stage. The rest of the ceremony seemed to stretch endlessly, with George's irritation growing at every activity listed in the program. When it came time to feed each other the cake, George nearly shoved the piece into Emily's mouth, deriving a grim sense of satisfaction from the act. "Serves her right," he thought smugly. In contrast, Emily gently handed him his piece, but inside, her anger simmered. She found George's behavior not only immature but outright cruel. Forcing her to nearly choke in front of the guests was unnecessary and wicked. Still, she chose not to retaliate. She couldn't predict what further stunts her husband might pull. So, she maintained the mask of a blissful bride on her happiest day. During the couple's dance, despite Emily's efforts to appear graceful and cheerful, it was painfully evident that the tension between them was anything but not romantic. Observant guests who suspected something was off between the couple now had their suspicions confirmed. George kept his distance, seeming to be more interested in dancing with a female guest who joined them on the dance floor. Even the MC couldn't ignore it and joked. "It seems our groom here can't tell the difference between a lady in white and one in red." But George didn't care. If the crowd wanted a dance, he reasoned, he'd give them one, regardless of who was on the receiving end. He despised the entire event and reveled in every opportunity to create chaos. For George, these small rebellions were his way of rebelling against his meddlesome family, led by his overbearing grandmother. He deeply resented their interference, especially working in the family business, which meant constant interaction with his domineering father and insufferable brother. This toxic dynamic had ultimately pushed him into this sham of a marriage. Though it was too late to undo the vows, George was determined to stir up enough scandal to rattle his family. The wedding dance, awkward and stilted, was just the beginning of what he had planned for Emily and the controlling Mason's clan. The ceremony finally ended around 6 p.m., but George was conspicuously absent during the vote of thanks. Instead, his father stepped in after George had slipped away during the gift presentation. Gavin, his best man, tried to fill the void, but George's absence almost brought Emily to tears. Gavin, noticing her distress, offered her some words of comfort. "Emily, don't get worked up. George can be impulsive, but he's a great guy most of the time." "Yeah, right," Emily replied with a bitter snort. Still, she managed to smile, partly because of the endless stream of gifts from the guests. The Mason family's friends were incredibly generous, and Emily began to imagine what it might be like to integrate into their affluent world. "At least this makes up for some of my losses," she thought, forcing herself to calm down. By 7 p.m., however, George still hadn't returned. His phone was unreachable, and no one knew where he had gone. "This is a unique one," Gavin quipped dryly when George's father questioned him about the groom's whereabouts. "It's usually the bride who disappears before or after the wedding, not the groom." Fuming, George's father retorted, "That boy is so childish and irresponsible. Let me lay eyes on him, and he'll hear from me." He stormed off to interrogate more guests, while Gavin, shaking his head in frustration, quietly left the venue, exhausted by the evening's drama. Meanwhile, Emily retreated to one of the rooms they had rented at Wedding Chateau, wanting to be alone. She hadn't expected the wedding to be perfect, but she never imagined it would be this disastrous. As regret crept in, she found herself wondering when the tears would come. Yet, to her surprise, she felt a strange strength and calmness she hadn't known she possessed. "You never know how strong you are until you have to be," she whispered to herself, lying back on the bed. A sudden knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. She didn't move, silently pleading for whoever it was to leave her alone. The door opened, and in walked George's grandmother. "Hello, beautiful," she greeted warmly, sitting beside Emily on the bed. "I'm so sorry for everything that happened today." George was just It's fine, Granny, Emily interrupted, her voice soft but firm. She pulled herself into a tighter curl, her wedding gown protesting the movement. The older woman sighed deeply. Only God knows the pain you're going through right now. None of us imagined things would turn out this way. On behalf of the family, I feel it's my duty to. Granny, please. If anyone is to blame, it's me. I'm the one who fell in love with a man like George, and I did nothing to stop this inevitable disaster, Emily confessed, struggling to find the right words. This feeling, she paused, unable to define it. Love, she finally added, her voice tinged with sorrow. A love that's brought me nothing but pain. Granny gently stroked her arm, her tone soothing. Don't be too hard on yourself, Emily. I'm fine. I just need to be alone for a while, Emily replied. Though Emily loved Granny for being like a mother to her throughout her years in Scotland, her insistence on addressing the issue was now frustrating. All Emily wanted was some peace. Sensing Emily's mood, Granny rose to her feet. I also came to tell you George is here. He's speaking with his father, but will join you soon, she said as she walked toward the door. Emily didn't respond. What was she supposed to say? Thank God? For all she cared, George could disappear again. But deep down, she knew she cared, it was the very reason she had married him in the first place. Emily remained silent, lying still in her pile of white lace. She wasn't crying, but she couldn't quite identify how she felt. Minutes later, a soft knock broke the silence. Frustrated, Emily thought, why won't they leave me alone? The door creaked open, and her stepmother entered. Emily, her stepmother called gently. Are you awake? Hearing the name, Emily quickly sat up. Auntie, no, I'm not sleeping. I was just. Her words trailed off as she glanced down at the cumbersome gown, weary of pretending everything was fine. Oh, my dear Emily, her stepmother said, opening her arms. Emily hesitated but eventually stepped into the embrace. A heavy weight seemed to settle in her chest, and she felt tears threatening to fall. Why now? Why in front of her stepmother, of all people? I'm sorry I couldn't support you more, her stepmother said, patting her back. You did your best. I just wish. Emily's voice broke. I just wish my father or my mother were here. The tears flowed freely now. This is exactly what your father foresaw, which is why he opposed the marriage, her stepmother said gently. Even if no one believes me, I love George. That's why I married him, Emily said through her tears. Her stepmother sighed. You don't know what you're saying, child. Emily pulled away from the embrace, and they both sat on the bed. She wiped her eyes as her stepmother continued, he clearly doesn't love you in return. I don't know, Emily murmured, unsure whether to defend George. It's okay, her stepmother said, her voice softening. Just relax. Everything will work out. Emily nodded and rested her head on her stepmother's shoulder. For a moment, they sat together in silence. The unexpected closeness stirred something unfamiliar to Emily. Though they had never been enemies, their relationship had always been distant. Her stepmother had been civil whenever Emily visited America, but she had kept her at arm's length, seeing her as the woman who had taken her mother's place. Now, thinking about the strained relationships in her life, her father, her step-siblings, and even George, brought fresh tears. Calm down, her stepmother said softly. Just then, her stepmother's phone rang. Glancing at the screen, she silenced the call. Emily shifted as her stepmother stood up. It's your father. He's probably worried, she said, preparing to leave. I need to go. Emily nodded absent-mindedly, her red, swollen eyes betraying her exhaustion. Tell him everything's fine, she said. Her stepmother nodded knowingly. I will. As the phone rang again, she added, take care of yourself, and stop crying. Everything will be okay. See you at church tomorrow. With a wave, she left, closing the door softly behind her. Emily sat back down, her thoughts heavy. Why does everyone keep saying everything will be fine when nothing feels fine? She lay back down, but before she could settle, the door opened again. Standing there was George. "Mrs." he drawled sarcastically, "it's time to go. Forever after awaits." He turned to leave but stopped when he saw she hadn't moved. "You'd better not keep me waiting," he snapped before storming out. Slowly, Emily stood and walked out to face the uncertain future awaiting her.